Okay. Oh, this is going to be a bit of a strange one, as I'm used to talking to big crowds of people. I think the best way to do this is I'll kind of go through my argument. If you want to chip in as I'm speaking, just feel free to do so, because it's best to keep this as informal as we can.
Is this do your intro?
No.
It's on politics. Is this going to be one of the modules for the MSc next year?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I'm not a computer science person. I'm from politics and international relations, and I think Dan asks me to do this to give the students a broader kind of awareness of what's going on in international relations, global politics, global economy.
So I'll be one of your students next year.
Oh, right, okay.
I've done the first year part-time. Yeah. Next year will be my...
Oh, yeah, okay.
And I'm trying to sell the course.
Oh, right, okay. Oh, that's potentially quite useful, because this sort of segues into the talk. I mean, a lot of people don't know what international relations and politics is all about, especially coming from computer science and so on. And really what I do and what we do in my department is teach courses on global security and the global economy, and look at questions such as why do empires rise and fall? What threats should we be concerned with? What are the kind of academic, intellectual, practical problems posed by the changing nature of threats? What type of world order are we moving to? Because obviously at the moment we're in a kind of interesting and very unclear point in history where lots of people are talking about the emergence of the post-American world. America's power's perhaps on the decline, China is on the rise, India's on the rise. What does that mean for international relations? What does it mean for security? But all these new questions are thrown up all the time, but more so at this point in history. What does it mean to move from the Cold War to this post-Cold War world where terrorism becomes the big problem, where we move from states to networks, which has been a theme through some of the talks today. There's a different type of kind of geopolitical, geo-economic environment. And so really what I try to do in the teaching is to get students to think about these broader questions, but always coming back to questions of cybersecurity. Hopefully, it's too early to know, if this is something that's going to be a useful part of the course, because you've done the first part. And so what I'm interested to sort of do in this talk is kind of give some very broad speculative questions about what I think is interesting about cybersecurity. Because one of the issues I have is, okay, today we've been talking about these issues related to fraud, espionage, kids getting online. I think all that is very interesting, but when you're coming at these issues from international relations, security studies, the sort of things we look at is, why did 9/11 happen? What's the implication of the events in the Middle East this year? What's the impact of the financial crisis on states and so on? So we're interested in a different order of questions to things like online security or kids online and so on.
Are you looking at sort of historical, or are you trying to predict the future?
Both, I think, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. What would you rather do in your studies?
Well, I'm particularly interested in the legal aspects, actually.
Yeah.
And you're saying we're now in a networked world.
Yeah.
Where you've got physical boundaries, where the internet has no boundaries.
Yeah.
How do you govern the internet? We were talking over lunch about the fact that China is a great thief of intellectual property, allegedly for the recording. And China regards it as normal business.
That
they're going out on the internet to find what they can and an international industrial espionage. There are Apple stores, fake Apple stores in China. Not even the employees know they're fake.
Yeah.
And it's how you govern the internet and how you find and how you prosecute criminals who may be national players, and how you can then tie that up with the financial crisis, in that China has vast sums of money to spare, and essentially their customers who are funding them are going bust. And how you can wrap all that up together.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good thing about the MSc is we have someone from the law department, we have myself, and I think there's some other sort of non-science subjects involved. And I think hopefully you can sort of, I mean, especially if you go on to do a dissertation, you can wrap that all together because you get different angles on these emerging problems. But I guess the first thing I would say is that, I come from my generation grew up with films like War Games. More recently, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, where the main character is this hacker. There's this recent book that I've talked to Dan in the department about, which is about the kind of networked, what can go wrong if a criminal mastermind wants to play around with this kind of network society. Or, someone was talking about the emergence of smart cities, which I think is one of the key areas now, because we're kind of creating a new type of city. Some people call them smart cities, people call them sentient cities, where everything, ubiquitous computing and so on. This book is a kind of science fiction thriller about what can go wrong. So my basic point is I've grown up with this as part of my popular culture. I don't need much convincing in terms of cybersecurity as a threat. But I think coming from sort of academic background, I have a tension in my thinking about these new problems, because all threats are political, which might seem rather obvious, but the threat horizon is a kind of trendy phrase that lots of security people like to use. We look towards a threat horizon, but that is not something that is commonsensical in any way. It's political, it's kind of human, it's fraught with flaws and human flaws. And I think there are three aspects to the threat horizon and why it's political. The first is uncertainty. Security is all about uncertainty. If you think of a problem like climate change, most people know that there's a huge controversy among scientists, economists, between those who say, okay, this is a very serious problem for the global economy, for security around the world in the coming decades, and those who say, no, the scientists have exaggerated the evidence, we shouldn't worry about it. And as we've seen recently, there's a whole politics to the institutions. So there's been controversies about universities in the UK dramatising certain evidence, and for a long time there's been debate about the politics in America, where people like George Bush are not going to buy into climate change as a serious threat. So uncertainty is what we're dealing with in all security problems. And I guess the political question is, what do you do in a condition of uncertainty? How do you kind of respond to this kind of uncertain condition? Second aspect is intelligence. Intelligence is obviously political. It's about who is included and who is excluded from the decision-making process. It's what we saw in the lead up to Iraq, and it's highly political. And I guess in looking at to cybersecurity, what interests me at the moment is in this emerging discourse of cybersecurity, who is included in thinking about the threat horizon and who is excluded. One of the questions I'm interested in is, are there perspectives outside of the kind of official government reports that we read that we need to listen to? One of the kind of comments that was made in the Commission report on 9/11 was that it's a failure, or there was a failure of imagination in the lead up to 9/11. So the political question might be, what is the failure of imagination regarding cybersecurity? What is being sidelined in our thinking? And finally, moral dimensions. Security problems are inevitably caught up with the moral dimensions of everyday life. If you take a problem like the war on drugs, some people would argue that the war on drugs continues to fail and we need radically new approaches to thinking about this problem. Yeah, the kind of policing security approach is just not working. Yeah, you can try to implement all the border controls that you want, but drugs are getting through. So you need to explore radically different policies. And there's, some very serious arguments that say, now is the time to think differently about this. But of course, it's not going to happen because the alternatives would confront us with moral problems that we don't really want to take seriously because it's too troubling. So the threat horizon is messy, and it's even messier because of the political economy of security. Fear sells. It's one of the most powerful political devices. If you want to get people to follow you, scare them. This is one of the classic lessons of political history. Fear is such a powerful device. If you look at the recent events over the financial crisis, what's the best way? I don't know where you work, but in the universities, everyone's terrified because, and so lots of changes are occurring, like the introduction of fees, and no one's really kicking up a fuss because we're terrified of losing our jobs. Because the story is, David Cameron knows very well, as someone who comes from PR, how to use fear. Look at Greece. This is what you're going to be confronting if you don't adopt these new measures. So fear is the most powerful tool in many ways. And people in the political economy of security understand this. Politicians understand this. So what I'm trying to say is, from this kind of political perspective on cybersecurity, the first kind of viewpoint is one of skepticism. I'm interested to know, well, in whose interest is the cybersecurity discourse in? What information is being sidelined? What is the politics of all this? Because if you look at history, threats, fears have often been exaggerated. But at the same time, threats, insecurities are often downplayed. So on the one hand, threats can be inflated, and other ways of looking at these issues can be deflated. So the other side of the threat horizon is the possibility of new types of global disaster, global threat, global accident. Because we shouldn't always trust the official stories about security, technology, and so on. And it might be that the more we create a networked global society, the more we create a fragile and vulnerable world order. That no amount of control, technology will manage. You create a new technology, you create a new insecurity. And that's kind of what interests me. And talking to the computer scientists, I think you confront the very real question of, is this network society the most sensible way to be developing society? And I think in some ways the things I've heard are much more radical than I anticipated. Anyway, we can talk about that. So I think when you confront these problems, you face this constant tension between inflation of threats and taking seriously the possibility that we could be creating new types of insecurity. And one of the things I like to use when I'm teaching is this quotation from Donald Rumsfeld. Now, the thing about this quotation, when he first said this, everyone's like, This is a sign of how crazy this guy is. But actually, I don't know what you guys think about this.
It's quoted so often
Yeah.
that actually people realise that it was probably very astute. It was probably very honest of him to say so.
Yeah.
And I think people use it in so many different circumstances now.
Yeah.
That it was probably wiser looking back than it was seen to be at the time.
Yeah. I mean, basically, if you look at the recent government report where they introduced the idea that cybersecurity is a problem. This is the Securing Britain in an Age of Uncertainty report. Basically, they give you lots of good evidence to justify the emergence of cybersecurity, and it's things like banking losses. 51% of banking losses related to cybersecurity occurred in 2009. They show we're on this path to increasing and dangerous cyber insecurity. And on the one hand, you could say it's great that cybersecurity is part of national security, because it's, if fraud, espionage at the corporate level is what we worry about now, then we've moved on from 100 years ago. Yeah? We're not in the era of national defense, we're in the era of national security. Yeah? Security is very different from national defense. National defense is about protecting borders, it's about territory. Yeah, we don't live in an age where we're worried about the French conquering UK territory. We might be worried about the Chinese, but even that is very, controversial. We're in this age of national security, and security is a very ambiguous term because we apply it to everything. Most of my anxiety in everyday life at the moment doesn't come from the fact that I'm worried about wars. Of course, I might worry about a terrorist attack, but living in Lancaster, it's not really something I go to sleep worrying about. Maybe in the longer term, I worry about new generations of bioweapons, but generally the things that I worry about are these everyday security issues. And often, or increasingly, they're related to the internet, because most of my life is just made possible at the moment because of the internet. But
the internet's the end product, but there's other things to worry about on the way to that, and that is energy security, fuel security, and everything
completely,
else, which is a feedback loop. To get your internet, you need those things, and those things are dependent on the internet.
That is the key kind of area of contemporary security policy. These kind of resource issues and the prospect of resource wars is probably one of the areas where, we should be worried, and you see the signs of it everywhere. Chinese involvement in Africa is a good example. But so there's an ambiguity in the term security, because security could be basically anything, but there is this aspect to security that I think Rumsfeld is pointing to here, and it's this idea of the unknown unknowns. You might have heard about this book called Black Swan, which is about risk. The black swan is the thing that no one really sees. It's the elephant in the room. It's what conventional thinking blinds us to. And so in books like Black Swan, a lot of contemporary thinking about risk, the issue is about the unknowns. It's about the things that we're blinded to in many ways. And so from my point of view, this is what I think is interesting about cybersecurity. Yeah? I want to look at the question of what are the unknowns? What are the things that we're not talking about? What are the things that are not in the government reports that maybe, and I see this when you talk to people privately, you get a slightly different impression of what's going on in this area and the concerns that people have more than you find in the official stories about cybersecurity. And so we're at this kind of interesting moment in world history where we had, for most of the 20th century, a period of order, stability, and certainty. I mean, of course, it was a constant anxiety about our self-destruction, but we knew who the enemy was. We knew what the game was about. But now we're in this era that, as the speaker talked about earlier, of networks, flash mobs. States may be collaborating with networks. Something very different is emerging. And I think the problem that hopefully we'll talk about in the course on MSc is how do you even begin to think about the world order that is emerging? Because if we were doing this course in 1975, it's quite straightforward because we can look at the world and think, well, we pretty much know what the actors are, we know what the problems are. But now things are evolving so rapidly, and it's partly due to the way the economy's changed, it's partly due to the rapidity and the speed of technological change. And I would say that part of the problem is the problem of speed of new technologies, the intensivity of new technologies, and the extensivity. So intensivity is the fact that you could be walking around tooled up with iPods and iPhones, and you're like this kind of very futuristic figure in terms of the things you can do without, things that even 5 years ago would be science fiction. Yeah? You can be managing a global enterprise walking around the streets of Lancaster because you've got all this kind of new technology and it's extensive. We're kind of, as the territorial reach of all these technologies has expanded. And so I think what is interesting me at the moment is, and it's kind of the same problem that the author William Gibson has confronted. I mean, have you heard of William Gibson? Basically why he's famous is that, or one of the reasons, is that he coined the phrase cyberspace back in the early 80s in a book, Neuromancer. And he's seen as one of the interesting kind of thinkers on technology and the future and science fiction and so on. But in recent years, especially since 9/11, a shift has occurred in his writing in books like Pattern Recognition and Spook Country. And he's basically saying that there was a time when people kind of rather naively thought about the future, about where technology was heading. And his argument is that we're at this strange historical moment where it's futile to make this kind of speculative fiction. And so his contemporary work is all set in the present, but with a kind of focus on the things that are occurring right now. And he says, I felt that I was trying to describe an unthinkable present, and I actually feel that science fiction's best use today is the exploration of contemporary reality rather than any attempt to predict where we are going. The best thing you can do with science today is to explore the present. Earth is the alien planet now. He's also said something that's become quite famous. The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. Yeah, we're into something that is very hard to work out. And reading across the areas of computing, design, engineering, there seems to be a similar position emerging about the future. I was reading an interview with some designers who work on new technologies. They said, it's a bit lazy predicting 15 years in the future. It's frankly a doddle. If you go into a technology company and ask what's going to be important in 5 or 10 years, they have a big guess. If you ask them what's going to be important in 6 months' time, that's much harder and it's much more work. Now, all this might be overstated. And that's kind of what I'm interested in thinking about, yeah? Because obviously it's in people's interest to stress the newness of things. Yeah? I mean, it's a classic strategy to say we're in uncertain unpredictable times. Yeah? If you can be the one who says you understand what's going on, that's your asset in the marketplace. But I think we should take seriously what Gibson is suggesting. And that's why I'm attracted to this idea on a very kind of intuitive level, because if you think of what's happened in the last 12 months, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but you know, I remember thinking back when the WikiLeaks business was kicking off, and thinking, well, this is an example of some of the stuff that I've been hearing about in terms of cybersecurity. This is pretty unprecedented as an event in global politics. And then as the year has gone on, it's just been one disruptive event after another. Think about what's happened in North Africa, the kind of Arab Spring, think about the riots in London, think about events in Japan with the tsunami. I think you could reasonably make the claim that we're living in this very disruptive moment, and the Murdoch scandal. Often I've been thinking this year, nothing more significant can happen. It's got to come to an end. You know, or are we in this moment of completely disruptive, permanent crisis that's kind of unending, linked to information technology? And this is kind of Gibson's argument. And one of the things he says is, the younger you are, the less you are a product of this culture that thinks about the future. If you're 15 or so, today I suspect you inhabit a sort of endless digital now. You know, something has happened to our sense of history, according to Gibson. Technology has unleashed this change, and it's constant crisis, it's rapid transformation, and that is where we are. I mean, you were going to say something.
What you're saying is the result, actually, of 24-hour rolling news.
Yeah.
For me, personally, the riots had no effect whatsoever.
Yeah.
For me, personally, that phone hacking.
Yeah.
What happened in Libya is irrelevant.
Yeah.
So for me, none of that has any impact on my life at all on a day-to-day.
Yeah.
But because it's on the news, it's been pushed at me along the lines of panic. Look, you get sucked into it in the... I'm walking around my little Wiltshire village, worrying whether someone's going to put a brick through the one-stop, and looking at every old lady as if she's a threat, because the village is inhabited by old ladies. Whereas it's a case of the rolling news and the way the digital media, the now society. Everyone is looking at what can we panic about now? What is the next big thing that we can actually get really, really excited about? Whereas actually, there's almost a case of, don't panic, calm down.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely it. It's this sense of, this constant barrage of information and panic.
I mean, you've got to look for breaking news. You've got to look for breaking news.
News,
something irrelevant happens somewhere in the world.
I mean, it's even...
Such thing as a slow news day.
I mean, it's even, when we look at the riots, I talked to people in London, and they were saying, well, there's still tourists going around. It was small pockets. It wasn't, but you felt, watching the news, oh my God, London's burning. People overseas thought that.
And how much was the riots fueled by news of?
Oh, exactly. But that, I think, is the interesting point, because, there was this kind of imitation that would occur very fast. And this is what I think you probably saw in North Africa. It's this kind of, the network society intensifies these events, and people mimic them.
Which has a direct implication on cybersecurity, in that the riots were fueled by people on Twitter, using their BlackBerry, and Facebook. BlackBerry has this very clever, secure messaging facility, which means that you can send messages to a lot of people very securely and can't necessarily be traced. Now, we're saying, what's happening in the Middle East is Arab Spring is fantastic, and aren't all these nasty regimes who want to turn off all the media because they're stifling the Arab Spring, and then all of a sudden it's a case of, Well, we really ought to start looking at Facebook and Twitter, and perhaps ought to think about turning it off.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they're fueling the riots in London.
Well, I mean, this is exactly what I think is the interesting point. I mean, if you look at China at the moment, I think the most interesting fact, one of the things I think is really interesting about the world right now is China spends more money on internal security than external security. And I imagine that's a trend that will stay the same because it's worried about this kind of networked effect of resistance because of new technologies. You might have heard earlier in the year this architect, artist, Ai Weiwei was detained. I mean, the thing about Ai Weiwei is that he had this blog which is really worth reading actually because it's about, his basic take is that the Chinese state is deeply paranoid and at the same time deeply irresponsible. I mean, you see this with a lot, it's developing so fast, it's making a lot of mistakes on the way, and it's not this kind of powerful, confident state. It's just, terrified of the masses and the new technologies. And it's more paranoid now after, it's looking around the world and saying, what if this could happen here? And I think you're right. One of the big issues is going to be how do increasingly paranoid states deal with policing their populations? Yeah, and I think probably the most interesting question for me is: are we going to see, in the coming years, are we going to see states that look very different in terms of the security technologies, the policing technologies that they use to control everyday life or secure everyday life? Is China going to look like a completely alien society to the societies we find in Europe, America? Or are we going to see convergence and exchange between the tactics and the technologies that are used in China? Is there going to be, a US technology company selling stuff to China, China selling stuff to the US, and a convergence in policing security strategies for states that are paranoid about populations and going to be increasingly paranoid? I mean, I was reading somewhere about this term cyber-structural unemployment, which is going to be basically, things are not going to go back to normal after the crisis. Yeah, we're entering a new type of labour market where, America's going to have to get used to 10% unemployment. And that's going to be, if that's the case, states are going to be increasingly precarious in terms of, paranoid. So what's going to be the implication of that? And so basically, I think what I'm trying to get to here is, okay, if we are in this period where things are changing very rapidly because of new technology, how do we begin to think about it? And my sort of take on it is there needs to be a dialogue between the computer scientists and the security people, the economists, the sociologists, whatever, to kind of expand how we think about this. Because often the computer scientists are not thinking about the political questions, and the political security people are not thinking about the technological questions, at least in my discipline. So I think we need to try and find a way to talk about the black swans, to think, okay, the technology, how could this, where do you think we're going to be in 12 months' time? If a government wanted to do this, if a network wanted to do this, what kind of threat horizon are we creating? Because I don't think we have the tools to think about these things very sensibly. I just don't see the dialogue emerging that expands our ways of thinking, and then we constantly get taken by surprise when maybe they're not surprising. I think how much time have I got, do you know? Okay, yeah, I mean, if there's any questions.
Left and right brain people will talk to each other.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. I mean, that's why I found it interesting talking to people in the Info Lab, because in some ways they're saying things that are more radical than, I would have suspected.
Radical in what way?
In terms of what is possible, both in terms of resistance, whether it's the, these sort of hacking networks or what governments can do.
One thing that I've learned is I've learned more about cybersecurity, IT, technology.
Yeah.
I've become more paranoid.
Yeah.
Not less paranoid.
Yeah.
In that I'm not on Facebook.
Yeah.
Will never ever be on Facebook.
And you've done a year of the cybersecurity.
Yes. I don't do Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn, but with the very, very basic, minimal one-liner of this is who I am. And if you know me, you'll find me, but if you don't know me, you won't find me, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So what they were talking about this morning of being able to profile somebody from who they are in their online presence.
You can do it automatically.
You reduce that online presence because you work on the basis that everything on the internet and everything electronic is almost like a post-it note on a lamppost somewhere for anyone to look at, but also it's a post-it note that can be searched. You can find that post-it note and all that stuff on. So it makes you more paranoid when you realise the potential. And then when you look about how the world and the countries become more networked, and how people say, isn't it marvellous how we have one guy in an office in one part of the country. I think there's a guy in London who monitors and controls all the lighthouses around the country electronically. Great. That means you hack him, you can turn off all the lighthouses because they're all remotely controlled.
Single point of failure.
Single point of failure, all the way. And it's a case of brilliant. We've sacked 500 lighthouse keepers, and we've got one bloke doing it. Isn't this great? But isn't it a vulnerability? Doesn't that make life difficult? Can you imagine if all the lighthouses were turned off?
Yeah.
Just like that one stormy night.
Yeah, I mean that's the. I mean
that sort of thing.
Yeah, but
makes you more.
Yeah, but this is the kind of double move that I think you have to make. On the one hand, talking to Dan and people like that, I become increasingly paranoid because I know that Dan didn't have a Facebook account, but he set one up because of the MSc and all this kind of stuff. And talking to him, I think, I buy everything online, and it does make me feel kind of a bit anxious, but. Really, is that not just part of the paranoia?
The whole problem with a lot of this is that there are two sides to it. There's the utility of the internet, and then there's the having to share some information to get. And you've got to basically decide whether you want to be able to use the tools and facilities and services available, or you want to kind of hide away from it.
I mean, I think there's a danger you can be too paranoid about that side of it. Actually,
I think a degree of paranoia is good.
Yeah.
But also, I do a lot of online stuff.
Yeah.
But I do it very securely, and there's things that I wouldn't do, and things which I do. So I wouldn't go to any a Wi-Fi hotspot. Would be great if all I'm doing is reading the newspaper. But I wouldn't access any password protected account via a Wi-Fi hotspot in case there's somebody listening in the middle. And you learn more. I won't do this, won't do that, won't do that. And there's all these people who don't know these things, who are going out there and doing it. So it's the education.
The Get Safe Online campaign, I think, is the start.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of 70-year-old who gets a laptop and who gets a letter from Nigeria, and that's what they're banking on, that someone's going to do that. But I think, you got to be careful not to become too paranoid about these things. But the kind of counter argument is when I see all this work being done on smart cities, sentient cities, ubiquitous computing, I think, okay, what is the potential accident that is getting, because we live in a culture that, and this is where I agree with people like Dan and others, that we live in a culture that is seduced by new technology.
Absolutely.
You don't see much critical debate on these things, really. If there's a new iPad or whatever, you want it. but the question is you know, what's the accident? What's the vulnerability in all this? And I don't think, as a society, we're having a serious discussion. And I think what I would like to do is kind of, you know, collaborate with computer scientists to think through scenarios and broaden the discussion a bit, really.
A couple of years